Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to the first 2022 RAY webinar. My name is Hillary Stevens. We're going to be hearing today about a new Living Shorelines app that is oriented towards South Carolina. I want to welcome you all to our series. And I will start off with a brief introduction of myself and Restore America's Estuaries, and then we'll get right into things. As a webinar, all of you participants are muted, but we look forward to hearing your questions, and there will be a couple of polls when we get started. So feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A, and we will be taking them at the end. I'll start off with a quick introduction here. Restore America's Estuaries is a national nonprofit. We're based in Washington, D.C. We are dedicated to the protection and restoration of bays and estuaries. We have 10 member groups. We serve as an alliance for these organizations. You'll see them on the map here. They're located around the country. And we serve as a convener and an advocate for these groups and really for all coastal residents and professionals working to take care of their local areas. As part of our program, we do at least monthly webinars like this with topics on a wide variety of areas that are relevant to coastal practitioners. I want to also call your attention to our upcoming summit. This will be next December, the 4th through the 8th in beautiful New Orleans. We're all looking forward to that. Please keep your eyes out. We do expect the call for proposals to go live in the next couple of weeks. So we'll be looking for sessions about all types of different topic areas, and we look forward to seeing you there. Without further ado, let me get right into introducing our speakers. As I said, my name is Hillary Stevens, and I will be moderating the Q&A at the end. Otherwise, I look forward to introducing you to our panelists today, who are Joy Brown, who is the Marine Program Manager at the Nature Conservancy. Joy earned a BS in Biological Sciences from Florida State University and a Master's in Biology and Coastal Zone Studies from the University of West Florida. Joy joined the Science and Stewardship staff of the Charleston Field Office of the Nature Conservancy in August of 2008, and she has more recently been leading the North Coast Resilience Project starting in 2016. She's working with communities in Horry and Georgetown counties to provide nature-based solutions for flood mitigation. Our other panelist is Stephen Creighton, PE. He's a civil and coastal engineer with 10 years of experience working on an array of public and private projects. As a project engineer with Water Environment Consultants, he provides design and permitting support for projects in the marine environment, particularly near rivers, estuaries, and coastal areas. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce our panelists today. And let me pull off my screen and I'll hand it over to you, Joy.
Thanks, Hillary. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen then and make sure everybody can see. Okay, are you seeing that?
Yes, looks good. Thank you. Go right ahead.
Great, thanks. So thank you so much to Hillary and her team from Restore America's Estuaries. This is a great opportunity for Stephen and I to bring forward a project that is close to my heart. I've been working on living shorelines in South Carolina since I started with the Nature Conservancy early on, close to 2008, 2010. So it's a great passion of mine, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to that today. So the impacts of climate change are being seen and felt by coastal communities across the world as increased intensity and frequency of storms and hurricanes, coupled with sea level rise, are changing the land and seascape dramatically, forcing cities, organizations, and nations to reconsider how and where to invest in its coastal resources. And so these storms and floods affect hundreds of millions of people, important infrastructure and tourism, with significant losses to local and national economies and livelihoods. So the Nature Conservancy has over 60 years of experience in conservation and restoration of coastal habitats and ecosystems, and is dedicated to protecting nature for people today and for future generations. So since 2007, the Nature Conservancy has led the development of coastal resilience, which is an approach and an online decision support tool to help address the devastating effects of climate change and natural disasters. So what you see on the screen is the plethora of the applications that are available through the public online platform TNC houses in its coastalresilience.org website. So when you have some free time, check out all the great resources. And today we're here to speak to the siting of living shorelines. And the Nature Conservancy works with our partners in their state or region to determine analysis needs and if there's the potential to house that information as an application on that coastalresilience.org website and the mapping portal. So the applications have been published in Australia, the Caribbean, Indonesia, Mexico, Central America, and the majority are actually within North America. As you can see here, the green balloons are noting the North America sites of information. So a lot of states will have different applications within their state for different communities. And in one case, there actually is a broader Gulf of Mexico set of information located there as well. So in the US, though, not every state has information showcased in the mapping portal, and some states have more than others. So the beauty of the concept is that once a TNC chapter develops a new application, it can be adopted and tailored to the needs of another state on a faster timeline. So when the South Carolina Department of Health was interested in developing educational tools for property owners to go hand in hand with their new living shoreline permit, the Nature Conservancy proposed we use lessons learned from other states and adopt and actually tailor the Living Shoreline Explorer app for our use. So in our case, we relied heavily on the existing North Carolina Living Shoreline Explorer app to better understand the needs for South Carolina. So I think there's a poll now on the screen. And we are interested to know what sector do you work in and where are you located? Oh, and I'm seeing participants coming up. So we've got majority of folks from government, but we do have a good engineering group here and some other folks, other sectors. And then noting where they're located. We have some South Carolina folks, but actually a lot, 73% from another state. Great. Thank you to everyone for coming on and showing us where you're representing. Here you go. I guess everybody can see this now. I'm going to go ahead and just stop sharing that. I think I can just take that off the screen. So, So there's actually this three-prong approach to educate property owners in South Carolina about the new living shoreline permit developed by DHEC. And they provide resources so they can educate themselves before applying for a permit. So there are three websites full of information, one from Clemson, of course, one from our Department of Health, and then one from the Nature Conservancy. So each of these websites contain links to the others to support the most inclusive information to be provided before property owners submit a permit application. So this includes an updated DHEC website with the information on how the permit was developed, the permit guidance, the definition of a living shoreline in South Carolina, and links to the other two resources from Clemson and TNC. So the Clemson website was produced in partnership with other living shoreline stakeholders. We were a part of that, but it was a bigger, broader group to provide the most concise and important information about living shorelines for property owners. So these include how to select a site, existing case studies, and upcoming training opportunities. And the Living Shoreline, the Nature Conservancy's Living Shoreline app is a decision support tool based on energy level. So property owners can use the tool to see if their shoreline is appropriate for a living shoreline project, and the energy and supplemental data can help support material selection. So the South Carolina Living Shoreline application is a map-based feature that houses information on energy levels for wind wave, boat wake, and max fetch using low, medium, and high colored categories. And you can see that on the screen now, along with the actual link to the application at the top of the slide here. So the supplemental data that's housed on the site includes existing DNR and TNC living shoreline projects. Those are the little purple dots that you noted here. The shoreline change rate, which is actually a value from a Department of Health study for the hazard vulnerability analysis, but it's very useful for property owners to be able to see how much their shoreline has changed. There is a live link to the Department of Natural Resources oyster harvesting data so that property owners can understand if they are along the coast where it's a bit saltier and they might use an oyster reef project, they can understand if they are within or outside of an oyster harvesting area. And then there's also the presence of marsh and tidal flats along with just general oysters. So now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to discuss the data and the analysis that was completed to develop the living shoreline application for South Carolina. Stephen?
Oh, Joy, there we go. There's the slide. Thanks, Joy. Before I dive into the details, I'd like to take a step back and talk a little bit about how we got here. So there have been numerous studies out there that have attempted to define a relationship between a living shoreline and some kind of wind wave component. But when we looked at that guidance, the metrics, they varied. They were a little bit all over the place. In the early days, fetch was the metric that was used the most. And that's a good first approximation. One, because it's the easiest to make, and two, because it's one property owners are most familiar with. But depending on your region, the critical threshold for a healthy marsh could be anywhere from half a mile up to 4 or say 5 miles. So eventually, guidance evolved from fetch to include wave height, and folks began classifying shorelines based on the energy one might expect from that wave height. But again, when we looked at those metrics, they were a little bit all over the place. So I know what you're looking at on the screen right now is a lot, but that was kind of my point. There's a lot of data out there, essentially. Some of it is messy, a little bit is contradictory, but it suggests that site suitability might be site specific. Next slide, please. Thank you. So ultimately, our methodology for this project relied on habitat research in North Carolina and the studies of Dr. Curran, Dr. Davis, and Dr. Thurikoff. In these studies, they researched over 250 natural marshes and oyster reefs and compared them to relative wave energy. But the key distinction in these studies was that each study concluded that an effective fetch should be used to determine relative wave energy. So think of effective fetch as essentially a weighted average. In addition to the distance, it also includes the frequency that winds blow from a particular direction. So another way to think about it would be if you have a really long fetch, but the wind never really blows from that direction, that distance is irrelevant. And if you're using that single distance to guide your site selection and your design, there's a chance you could be over conservative. So in my opinion, this was a key paradigm shift using effective fetch and relative wave energy, and one that we wanted to adopt for this study. So on the left, what you're looking at are natural fringing marshes, specifically Spartina. And as you may suspect, in the lowest energy regimes, you have the largest number and most healthy natural marshes. And as you progress in energy, both the number and width of those marshes decrease. Over on the right, we're looking at the presence of natural oyster reefs. And interestingly, Dr. Thurkoff found that energy was a pretty good predictor on where natural oyster reefs were present. He concluded that that number was about 500 and above which oyster reefs didn't really exist where he studied. Now, in his study, he used the top 5% of wind speeds for an apples to apples comparison with the study on your left, which used the top 20% of wind speeds. We sort of reverse engineered the process and came up with a value of 200. So if you see on your right, we're kind of relating the two there. So now we have a framework to think about where living shorelines might be most successful and also the kinds of materials we might want to use. So in the lowest energy regimes, those are going to be most suitable for natural plants or natural oysters. And as you progress in energy, you're going to want to incorporate more structural components to complement your nature-based approaches. Next slide, please. So to model wave energy, we developed an application of the USGS fetch and wave model. It's an open source model that runs through an ArcGIS extension. It's a raster-based tool, and while there are other inputs and outputs, those are some of the key ones that we use for this analysis. So we use the tool to determine relative wave energy, and relative wave energy is determined from effective fetch. And as I mentioned before, effective fetch is critical of the wind frequencies. So to determine wind, we looked at 10 years of historical wind data from the 5 stations you see on your left, and then taking the top 20% wind records, we determined the frequency that winds blow from a particular direction. So that's the wind rows you see on the right side of your screen. So in South Carolina, at least, about 12% of the time winds are blowing from the southwest direction. Next slide, please. So at each cell in the raster, the model calculates fetch distance, and it calculates fetch distance for each wind direction from the wind rows from the previous slide. Then using the frequency that winds blow from a particular direction, we can determine an effective fetch. And then with effective fetch, you can estimate wave height, wave period, and relative wave energy. So there's a little snippet of the results from the model. And then we classified those relative wave energy results into the 3 classes you see there on the bottom right of your screen. Next slide, please. Now, in South Carolina, not all of the shorelines are exposed to wind fetch. A lot of it is sheltered, and they don't get a lot of wind wave action. But we know that boats have the potential to harness a lot of the energy that you might experience at a shoreline. Now, quantifying boat wakes at a specific site is pretty difficult to do, and for a statewide approach like this, we needed to simplify the analysis a little bit. So what we did here was we looked at AIS ship records and projected where we thought the highest density of boat traffic would be. So what you're seeing on the left there are density of boat traffic, and based off of how many vessels we expect to see in a given water body and the size of the water body, we came up with an indices or a range of boat energies. And we group those energies into low, medium, high, similar to the wind waves. Next slide, please. So when you put it all together on the Living Shoreline Explorer app, we interpolate all the results onto a shoreline. Joy showed that earlier. So once you get to the site, you can type in an address, or you can zoom in wherever you'd like. Here, I've zoomed into Goldbug Marina, which is located near Mount Pleasant along the Intercoastal Waterway. And this is a report you can generate from the website. There's even an existing living shoreline there, identified by the little purple icon. And when you click on that, it gives you more information about the living shoreline. Here, the wind waves, since it's sheltered, the wind waves are in the low category, but due to boat wake energy, we classified it as a medium energy shoreline. And there on the right, you can see, this is actually a living shoreline that Joy worked on. They incorporated both oyster castles and natural oysters. And you can see what a wonderful job it's done throughout the years. Next slide, please. So before I hand it over back to Joy to take home, let me just talk about some key takeaways. So key takeaways are effective fetch, using effective fetch to determine relative wave energy. It gives us a better proxy for establishing suitability of a living shoreline site. And not only if it's suitable, but it gives us clues on the kinds of materials we might want to use. So in your lowest energy regimes, those are going to be most suitable for natural vegetation or live oysters. And then as you progress in energy, you're going to want to incorporate more structural components to complement those nature-based solutions. And I won't say that above 700 energy level that precludes a living shoreline, but you're definitely going to want to look at putting some substantial structures out there. Well, thank you. Joy, back to you.
Thanks, Stephen. So I just have a couple more slides to talk about the process here in South Carolina. So I just kind of was thinking, what are the major categories that we might find here? So the first thing that we suggest that property owners do is educating themselves. So I mentioned those 3 great websites that serve as a pretty, I think, complete and comprehensive resource together that property owners can actually utilize and get some general information, think about project siting and characteristics, material options and case studies. And so then from our Living Shoreline app, you can print out the report like Stephen just showed you, and you can actually take that and contact our Department of Health. And Ben Stone, who works at the Department of Health, actually used to also work for DNR and did a lot of actually installation. So he has a lot of experience, and you can speak to him and actually bring out any questions you have at that time. And then you can also request a pre-application meeting. So this is where staff from Department of Health and Army Corps at a minimum will come together and answer any questions you have. And so that report that you can create from the Living Shoreline app is actually very useful to take into those meetings. and give the staff from the agencies a much better understanding of your site. And then they can help you select materials, or you can actually hire a contractor. So contractors are a great resource to help support the permitting process, the development of the project. And you will actually have to have stamped engineer drawings in South Carolina to get that permit submitted. And finally, then you would submit your permit application through the e-permitting interface. And I believe when you do that, it also triggers the Army Corps of Engineers federal process as well. And so it's the joint application would go through the two of those. And I've included the links down here for those 3 websites that I've mentioned a couple times so far. So then I just wanted to speak a little bit to how the South Carolina Living Shoreline app has been used so far. So I mentioned the report that you can take with you. You've seen now this is the second site with the same kind of report with the energy. And you can take that into your pre-application meetings. But it does show those energy rankings. And I will note, I mentioned the supplemental data. If you select that, that will also show up in your report once you print it out or make a PDF of it. And so I'll give you one example of how it's already been used. The Living Shoreline app was where we were working with a coastal property owner who was very interested in putting in a living shoreline. So by the time we met with him on his property in June of 2021, the new permit from DHEC had been established, which occurred in May. But he immediately reached out to DHEC for a meeting. But at the time, the response on the new permitting was a bit slow. And we know that our state agencies will have from time to time issues with staffing. And so I believe that they've upped all that. So we've taken care of that. But at the time, it was a bit slow. So in the meantime, we actually worked with that property owner and showed him our application here. So he was actually able to create that report similar to what you see on the screen and take that into DHEC to request his pre-application meeting. So he also invited me to attend that meeting. So it was a great learning opportunity for me to see how a private property owner would go through that process. So during that pre-application meeting, we were able to use the report and discuss the size and materials that could be used to build an oyster reef-based living shoreline project to reduce erosion along his family's property. So in his case, and I'm not actually showing his site now, I didn't want to share a specific property area, but in his case, there was a lot of boat traffic, and they've seen over the years some shoreline erosion, especially after storms. So the resources that were provided in the app were very useful to help educate him. He was able to get a lot more education from going to the Clemson site. And then we were able to take those things into that pre-application meeting with him. So to my knowledge, there's not been a full living shoreline permit submitted to DHEC, last I checked, but I know there will be soon. So not just by the gentleman that we were working with, but I'm actually working on my own permit to install a 1-acre living shoreline project in Georgetown. So, but I do hope the app and additional educational resources will make it easier for property owners to apply. And I have seen a lot of interest from property owners since the permit has been developed. So we look forward to working with folks into the future on that. All right, so I'll stop sharing my screen now and we will take some questions.
All right, thank you so much. This is terrific. And there is a lively conversation going on in the chat. I will try to get you up to speed. First and foremost, there is a big shout out from a fellow Florida State alum who is happy to see you here.
Thanks.
Another shout out, love that you are explicit about wind wave energy. Very well done. We've had a bunch of questions about the links that you've, the text to the links that you've included. And wondering if you'd be willing to make your slides available to people. We can certainly post those on our website so that people can find all the links. Would you all be willing to do that?
Sure. And while we're chatting, I could try to also paste them in the chat box here so folks could actually have access to them. So. Perfect.
Thank you. Patricia asks, how are hurricanes taken into account, if at all?
I guess that's for me.
Sure, go for it.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Stephen.
So if one of those 5 weather stations measured wind speeds, then it was included. We used the top 20% fastest wind speeds in a 10-year span. So
I would
I will
imagine that
say-
stretch of coast is likely to get a hurricane in any given 10 years.
I'm sorry.
I would imagine that stretch of coastline is likely to get a hurricane in any given 10-year
Oh
period.
yeah. Oh yes. Yeah. So if it caught it, it was included. But I will say we use the top 20%. So you're getting those less frequent events as well as more of the everyday weather events.
Okay, so it sounds like yes, and whatever happened in that 10-year period, the extreme events are going to be included. Is there a report or technical paper written about the project that you might be able to share?
Yes, and actually there are reports in the website. So when you go into the Living Shoreline app, there is okay, maybe I could share my screen real quick again.
Yep, you should be able to.
Okay, and you can see that now?
Yep.
Okay, so when you go into the application, there is information up here, again, links to the other websites, but there's an instructions section that goes into a document that will tell you more about using the application. But in the methods is actually a lot of information pertaining to the resources and the research and the process that we went through. So those documents are included. And then the infographic button is actually, it's if anyone's seen the NOAA infographic comparing like hardened shorelines to living shorelines. But the methods button is where you can find a great report, very comprehensive, that has links to other things and all the work that was done to go into it. So if you're wanting all the real nuts and bolts, that's where you go.
And it sounds like there are quite a few people here asking for nuts and bolts. So that's great. Thank you.
Good.
Let's see. Someone was asking about the need to have stamped engineering plans and that really impacts costs. Are there plans to change that? Is that likely to change anytime soon?
I would say that would actually be a question for DHEC, but I will do my best to answer it. So
Sure.
I think that it will go through a 5-year review. So maybe after the next 5 years, they might decide to change it. But because there's not general siting criteria, the permit is still very loosely worded. They needed something to make sure people weren't going to just be dropping old washing machines, along their shorelines and stuff, I guess.
Right.
So yes, I do hear that though about the cost, and that can be cost prohibitive for some folks. And so I know it's not something we've successfully made it through, but we are looking at how there might be potential to bring some resources into the state to help property owners, especially maybe lower income folks that might need some financial assistance to make it through the process. We've not successfully made it through there yet, but we are looking to other examples that the Nature Conservancy has done in other states, and some have been successful and some are still trying to do it as well. So hopefully we will find a process to help alleviate some of those funding issues.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, next question. Mary asks, are there any future plans to engage in Living Shorelines app for the Great Lakes states?
I do not know that, but if I can get the contact information, I could contact TNC in some of those states and ask. Again, it's basically like each state kind of works with their communities to determine what the needs are and how to get that information best posted. And so, there are different places that the information can be used, but I would specifically have to reach out to TNC in those areas and ask if that is something that they're looking at utilizing.
Okay, great, thank you. And yeah, I can try to save the chat and hook you up.
Okay.
Okay, Melody says, thanks for all the good work to make it easier for folks to choose a living shoreline. What are the permitting requirements for a new permit that came online in May 2021 in South Carolina? Does the regulation require that you show that a living shoreline isn't suitable before you can get a seawall permit. I know some states have those types of regulations in place.
No, and I'm hoping that's Melanie Ray Colt. She's awesome.
Yes, it is.
Okay, awesome. No, you don't have to show that in South Carolina. I know that is the option in other states, but it's not the case here. They are trying to promote more natural solutions, especially by bringing this new permit online. And the permit is still, like I said, it doesn't have direct guidance. It doesn't say it has to be within X number of feet of this, or X number of length or less. It doesn't say any of that. The permit is a bit more loosely worded so that DHEC can help to maybe figure out maybe some opportunities that we may not know right now might exist and work in South Carolina, but into the future. So they wanted to leave it a little bit more gray. Theirs is really, the wording, it gets a bit more to, keeping a land water connection, wanting to use some more greener elements, make sure that you're not impacting existing resources, and make sure that you're not impeding navigation, things like that.
Great, thank you. Aaron is coming from Virginia, and he asks, we have a lot of online tools for living shoreline suitability in Virginia. However, I don't think we have this wave energy tool. What would it take to get this tool for Virginia? You sort of commented in reference to the Great Lakes, but
yeah. Well,
so it sounds like
specifically the wave and energy stuff, I would take that back to Stephen, because Stephen and the team that he worked with from Biohabitats, Geoconsultants, they all worked together to develop this. So I would take that question back to Stephen.
Yeah, I'd love to work in Virginia. So let's link up and see if we can make that happen.
Fantastic. Okay, Charles says, great to see the Goldbug Living Shorelines project processing along so well. The improvement is significant. How is the health of the oysters today? Any signs of decline, or is it all positive?
At the Goldbug Reef, that was one of the first locations we found where, so we use a 3-inch oyster as like a basic size metric to gauge growth. And normally we say 3 inches in about a couple of years, that's based on like harvest information and stuff. But Goldbug was one of the first projects that I put in that I found 3-inch oysters in less than a year. So we had very immediate, rapid growth, and we continue to this day to continue to get different size classes. So we know that it wasn't just like one pulse, right? We continue to see different sizes. So we know that there's new growth occurring. And then I think that really rapid growth also is a testament to where it's located, because it's between the Charleston Harbor and what we call Breach Inlet on the Intercoastal Waterway. So there's a lot of water moving through there. So I think it brings a lot of food resource for the oysters. So I've not seen them declining. I've seen them continue to be strong and growing on every bit of surface that's available there. But I would say, although the oyster growth is awesome there, I am super jazzed about the marsh grass growth at Goldbug. So over our 5 years of monitoring that site, we saw that, like what I call the high tide vegetation line. So it's the vegetation that sticks up at kind of a constant line at a high tide. That moved forward 75 to 100 feet closer to the reef. Not to mention these little islands that we saw pop up kind of right behind the reef. I don't count that as that movement, but the oysters are great. The marsh is beautiful. We're really happy with that project.
That's so encouraging. That's wonderful. Thank you. Next question, Adam writes, I'm curious about the results with respect to heavier industrial areas characterized by man-made features such as piers and wharfs. Is there any sort of sheltering or fetch limiting influence to some of these features in any of your modeling results? So Stephen, I'm going to hand that to you. Do you want me? He's asking about how man-made features that jut out into the water like a pier might influence fetch, and if your modeling takes any account of that.
So the question's asking about shoreline irregularity, and if
well, particularly in built-up areas. If you're looking at siting a living a shoreline that might be adjacent to a pier or a wharf that would impact the wave energy, particularly that might interfere with with fetch and with wind-driven waves.
Got it.
If your modeling is able to account for that.
Yes and no. So the way the model works is at each cell in the raster, it is looking at fetch in a full 360-degree angle. And then based on the frequency, or the percent of times winds blow from each one of those angles, it creates an effective or a weighted average fetch. So for this statewide approach, we had to, we needed some sort of accurate shoreline delineation tool in order to determine what's water and what's land. So you're really only as good as the data that goes into it. So getting high quality shoreline data is critical there. If something is very site specific like that, you probably want to really zoom in and ensure that those man-made features are being delineated correctly. So I guess yes and no. It is included if it was in the data. If something very site specific like that, you probably need to double check and confirm your shoreline data is accurate.
Okay, thank you. I know in some areas that's going to be extremely challenging to get a really detailed shoreline map that includes all of those, but as you say, the modeling is, no matter what you're doing, modeling is only as good as the data that you get to put into it.
Yeah. And I will say there was a lot of internal review that went into all the inputs. So a lot of eyeballs went on to making sure that we had good data.
Let's see, Eddie is asking, who funded the project? Was it a Nature Conservancy sponsor or state funds, or are you in a position to address that?
Yeah, sure. So actually, we had a sorry, my dogs are making noise. We had a contract with the Department of Health, and they were actually utilizing NOAA 309 funding. So NOAA funding paid for that work. And then we utilized TNC as kind of some match resources for some time that was not covered under that. But the majority of the funding was from NOAA. And we were able to contract those with Biohabitats and Stevens Group and Geoscience.
That's great, thank you. And let's see, someone is asking if you can post the link to the TNC Living Shoreline Explorer. Is that, I know, I saw that you posted a batch of links. I guess that wasn't, maybe it wasn't one of them.
I thought I posted that one.
Okay, well, the chat's getting pretty long at this point. So.
Okay, I was gonna say, if this is not the one you're looking for, feel free, let me put my email up here and email me if that is not the right thing that you're looking for.
And I see that there are a couple of folks like Aaron put his contact info, and I will send that along to Stephen. So I will be saving the chat and getting these folks in touch with each other. So let's see. Rosemary's asking, I live in Seattle. Do I need an engineer here? I don't know if you guys are in a position to speak to Washington State.
I'm sorry, I do not specifically know, but I would suggest reaching out to the coastal managers in your area and asking them, because like even South Carolina and North Carolina, we both have living shoreline permits and they're very different. So yeah. It's going to be state-based. And I'm not familiar enough to know if that's the case in Seattle or not.
And I know we have had folks from Washington State on to present on this webinar series on a program they have called Shore Friendly. So if you want to go into our YouTube channel and look for that, or simply Google it and it'll get connected to some of the folks working out in Washington State, and they can hopefully get you connected to some resources there. Okay, I think that is all of the questions that I have at this point. All right. And do we have any other questions coming in for our panelists today? And again, lots of people have been asking for references, because there were a lot of links that came out And I will, if y'all are willing to share your slides, we will get them posted on our website. We will have a recording of this webinar, and within about a week, we'll have that posted to our YouTube channel. You can either just go into YouTube and search for Restore America's Estuaries, or if you go to our website, it'll be loaded up there as well. And I will have contact info for these folks. And for those of you who have put your contact info in the comments, I will forward them to our panelists. So we've got lots of connections going on here. I want to thank you both very much for your time. This has really been a fantastic event. It's always wonderful to hear about some success stories with the projects that you've implemented, but also I know a lot of folks are really hungry for tools that they can use to help in that critical outreach design phase of encouraging living shorelines. And so this is a great example of a user-friendly tool that's got, I know some of these folks are looking for tools and others are wanting to look under the hood and check out the nuts and bolts. And so thank you for giving us a chance to do that. Joy and Stephen, we really appreciate your time here. With that, I will go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks, everyone. And as I said, our call for proposals for our upcoming summit will be coming out soon, so stay tuned.